It's a pleasure to be a panelist at this year's CARE conference. My name is Paul Griffin. I'm a professor of management at UC Davis, and I've been researching climate finance issues, mostly from an accounting and disclosure standpoint, for about the last decade. I have a number of papers that I've published, but today I want to talk about four papers. Two are published. One is a sort of a working paper, and the fourth paper is a work in process, some thoughts that I'm working on at the moment. So of the four papers, the first one was published in Nature Energy, and this was on extreme weather issues. And the main takeaway of that was the inability of the market to adequately price the risk associated with the climate risk, whether it's transition risk or physical risk. So there was an unpriced risk that we concluded in the market. So that was the first paper, the Nature paper. The second paper was in a science journal. The journal is called Weather and Climate Extremes. And there the focus is on really temperature, on heat waves. And heat wave is when you have a sort of a high temperature over more than a few days, and we're looking at what's going on in the financial markets in terms of firm valuations when these heat waves occur. And the setting for that study was in the United States, but we have a follow-up, what I want to talk about briefly, for heat waves in the European environment. That's equally interesting environment to engage in research on. The third paper that I've been working on, right now it's a working paper, but the focus there is on disclosure and on not heat waves, on wildfire in the United States. Particularly in the western states, and even as far west as Hawaii, and as far north as the northern northwest states, the United States and Canada. So it's a serious major problem, and so we're looking into that as well. The fourth paper deals with governance, corporate governance systems. And the issue there is how well or how able are the various corporate governance systems all over the world able to integrate or align themselves with what's called the TCFD disclosure framework. So I'll talk about that. So let's go to the first paper. That's the Nature Energy paper. And there the issue was extreme weather and the various climate risks that are associated with extreme weather. And on that particular paper, we really identified sort of two aspects where the balance sheet of a firm can be affected. Aspect number one is really looking at the carbon assets. So some firms will have carbon assets, and it could be oil and gas in the ground and things like that. And the question is whether those carbon assets can actually be produced and sold and marketed to consumers, particularly if the price of carbon is sufficiently high, whether it's taxed or whether it's some sort of levy, things like that. So what we looked at is we looked at the scientific evidence on that, and we found that when that scientific evidence was published, markets hardly budged. And then when Bill McKibben came along a few years later and talked about the terrifying math of the carbon budget, the markets hardly budged. And so our conclusion from that was these sort of carbon risk assets were largely underpriced. This may be changing in more recent years, but certainly at that time, this is going back a decade or so, there was very little evidence that the market was aware of what's called the carbon budget, or the unburnable carbon and carbon assets on firms' balance sheets. So that was one element of unpriced risk. The other side of the balance sheet is on the liability side, and here you have increasingly higher compliance costs. You have higher regular costs. You have a potential higher cost of social cost of carbon, things like that. And are these adequately recognized on firms' balance sheets? We came to the conclusion the answer is no. And the sort of the related aspect of this is whether the liability that could be brought on firms for marketing and selling carbon-rich products like oil and gas and so forth. Are those liabilities sufficiently recognized? And again, the answer was no. There was some evidence that the liability was there, but in terms of the implicit cost of carbon, that liability was way, way too low. We're seeing a little bit of headway going on now with the Dutch decision and the Exxon board member change and the Chevron acknowledgement that Scope 3 emissions are something that they need to think about. Again, the message there is on price risk. So that's study really number one. Study number two is we're looking at these sort of temperature extremes. And we're both looking at the US setting and in the European setting as well. And the main message there is the same thing, that we're getting some reaction from the markets when these heat waves occur in the areas in which the companies are operating. But the response is not sufficient. The response is consistent with sort of an inefficient market, and it's a little bit lagged. And so we'd like to see more information, more disclosure, more awareness by investors of these sorts of events and how they relate to the operations of firms. There was some evidence that the climate issues are worse in the southeast and in the southern states in the United States, and they're certainly worse in the southern countries in Europe, like Greece, Portugal, Spain, and so forth. But again, the main message is on price risk because of these heat waves. We'd like to see more disclosure in terms of the risk associated with heat waves, not just what's happened in the past, but looking to the future. The third paper that we're looking at is a pure disclosure paper, and that is really focusing on wildfires. We know that wildfires are a major issue today. They're occurring all over the western states, perhaps in other parts of the world as well. We focus on the US situation. And the results here are sort of twofold. One is the disclosure is what I say woefully inadequate. That's item number one. Item number two, there is some evidence that the companies disclose in line with the number of wildfire days for which they're affected during a particular year. So we're seeing some linkage there between the wildfires and the disclosure, but it's just not enough. And the other point of this paper, which was a little bit surprising, and that was the idea that the disclosures, they tend to be backward-looking. They're looking back on things that have happened. What's really relevant for the market is to look forward. What are the risks that the firm faces in terms of the future liabilities or future severity of wildfires? And there's very little disclosure there. What there is very general. It's boilerplate, and it's sort of peppered with cautionary language. That's not a satisfactory situation. So I know the SEC is working on that, but right now we still have insufficient disclosure. Lastly, I'm developing these ideas about corporate governance systems, and we want the TCFD disclosure framework to be instituted globally. And getting that to be instituted globally means that we've got to integrate it or align it with the corporate governance systems that are in different parts of the world. In the US, we have a sort of a distributed shareholder or dispersed shareholder governance system. If you go to Asia and parts of Europe and so forth, it's more of a blockholder system. So what system is best for integration or alignment of governance along with the TCFD framework? And it's not clear which one is best. And the other thing about that is getting this global hybrid model to be effective will require time. But we don't have a lot of time in terms of getting disclosures out there such that we can move quickly or efficiently to a 1.5C economy. So that's the issue I'm working on with respect to aligning governance systems to disclosure framework. So with that in mind, I'm very happy to have presented my views today, and I look forward to discussions in the panel sessions and to answering questions that the various participants would have. Thank you very much.